album rocks. The sophomore album is a tricky thing to do, especially when you kill it with your debut. People are going to expect you to top it and make something better in every single way. It's a lot of pressure that many artists crumble under, but at the same time many artists try to do something completely different than their debut, which sees fans and critics being alienated. The Killers, MGMT, Block Party, Panic at the Disco, all bands who are criticised for changing their sound on their sophomore releases despite the fact that retrospectively all of those albums were not only great, but in nearly all of those cases, the best albums the band would ever do. So when Weezer, a band acclaimed for being the complete antithesis to grunge with their sugary, bright yet heavy power pop sound, decided to follow their debut album with a heavy, depressing and incredibly abrasive emo album, people were not impressed to say the least. It did not reach anywhere near their sale expectations, it was critically destroyed and fans absolutely hated it. The album forced the band to almost break up and led Rivers Cuomo down a very dark road of depression and self-doubt. By the time their follow-up album was released, the band cut down the amount of Pinkerton songs in their live set drastically, and up until 2011 they would only play singles from it, if anything at all. Nowadays you talk to a Weezer fan and basically all of them will tell you their favourite album by the band is either Blue Album or Pinkerton, mostly because any other opinion is factually incorrect. I remember when I first listened to the band's discography, I found Pinkerton to be the most confusing album that the band had ever done. Every other album I had strong opinions on. I loved the Blue Album, everything until Make Believe was decent, and everything from 2005 till 2013 was either mediocre at best or absolute garbage. But Pinkerton was a strange album. It was an album that I had to listen to repeatedly to really get a grasp on. It's an album that I completely misunderstood initially, but as of now, I consider Pinkerton to be in my top 5 favourite albums of all time. Pinkerton is a masterpiece. It's in my opinion the album that all modern day emo bands try to emulate, for better or for worse. It's an incredibly hard experience to get through, but it's one of the most honest, direct and personal albums I've ever heard. The album's production was one fraught with issues from beginning to end. Following the huge success of their debut, the band decided to take a well-earned break over the Christmas holidays. During this time, Rivers began writing and recording songs for the band's new album. The album was intended to be a concept album called Song from the Black Hole, a rock opera which expressed Rivers' mixed feelings towards rock and roll success. Feeling that his songs were incredibly simplistic, he found himself drawn to listening to operas and musicals such as Madame Butterfly and Jesus Christ Superstar, and was inspired by how they mixed music and narrative. The tracks were meant to segue perfectly throughout to present the album's story seamlessly. The band would share vocal duties and essentially play different characters throughout. There were also due to be guest vocals from Carl Koch, Rachel Hayden and John Wasser. Rivers rewrote a lot of musical ideas and songs he had already written to fit around the narrative and recorded demos for every track, pitch shifting his voice to fit the female characters. In early 1995, Rivers had extensive surgery to fix his legs, one of which was shorter than the other. The physiotherapy following this affected his songwriting, leading him to spend long periods of time hospitalized under the influence of heavy painkillers. In August 1995, the Black Hole sessions began in the same studio where the band recorded their debut. The band recorded a few of the songs before putting the album on hold. Rivers went to Harvard University to study classical composition. This led him to feel incredibly isolated while he struggled to recover from his surgery. He started to write new songs which were darker, more visceral and more personal than anything he'd written before. Once he returned to the band, he decided to scrap songs from the Black Hole, intending to make a much darker and more abrasive album inspired by his feelings of loneliness and isolation. Basically every song from the Songs from the Black Hole concept album is out there, whether it's through demos, songs recorded during the studio sessions, or even songs that were recorded during the Pinkerton sessions and ended up on that album. Many people have released collections on YouTube of what is a rough idea of what the album would have been, and it's definitely worth a listen. I think it would have seen similar backlash because the music is still very hard hitting and abrasive, but it's very interesting and it's full of a lot of really great ideas. To be honest, it's better than most of their post-Pinkerton releases. At the beginning of 1996, the band regrouped to finish their sophomore release. The intention intention was to make an album more reminiscent of the heavier, more aggressive sound of their live performances. Throughout '96, the band were grouped to record while Rivers was on break from university. A handful of songs recorded during the Black Hole sessions were placed on the album, including Tired of Sex, Get You, and the B-side I Just Threw Out the Love of My Dreams and Devotion. The album was finally released on September 24th, 1996. At 34 minutes long, it clocks in 6 minutes shorter than the Blue album, completely by design, as Rivers didn't want the album to outstay his welcome. And this is an album that completely justifies every second of its runtime. The opening track, Tired of Sex, is from the get-go more abrasive than any of the band's previous tracks, containing a large amount of guitar feedback, noise, and loud and sharp synthesizers which blend perfectly with the distorted drum lines, thumping bass lines, and Rivers' vocals which start off quiet before being screamed at the top of his lungs. The track has a very Pixies-sounding chord progression which serves the punky, aggressive sound perfectly. It's a song that straight away shows Rivers sticking a middle finger up to the rockstar life that success led him to live. He sings about his frustration in meaningless encounters and how he wants to meet someone who will stay in his life. While the song's lyrics are on the surface about one-night stands and Rivers lamenting about wanting to meet a girl he can settle down with, I think the song also works well as a statement about just basic human relationship. How many people will come quickly in and out of your life and how meaningless that basic interaction can be compared to a long-lasting friendship or relationship, and how once you find fame and success, those interactions become less and less lasting. It's a song that perfectly sums up that feeling of loneliness and isolation that this album is completely full of. The second track, Get You, is just as fuzzy and loud, but is one that feels a lot more like it could have fit on the band's first album. It's very catchy and simple, like much of that material, but the song does still have the very harsh and bitter sound that this album's known for. This song is a confident display of telling the girl you like how you feel. It is tongue-in-cheek, with Rivers' lyrics being self-deprecating while also showing him pleading with the girl to see the good parts that he's got. It's one of the simplest songs on the album and also one of the shortest, but it's still a really great track. Track 3, No Other One, also has that very power pop rock and roll style their debut was filled with, but with more aggressive instrumentation. I love the guitar lines in this song, having a very slide guitar sound. The track is all about the narrator having a relationship with a drug-addicted and cheating girl. He sings about the strain that her cheating and drug abuse is having on their relationship, but how he can't let her go and be without her. It's a great, simple little pop rock song about how in many relationships you'll ignore the bad parts and focus on only the good parts, even if that leads to self-destruction. Why Bother is about being too afraid to go after a girl due to fear of rejection and eventual sadness. This is a song that I think appeals to the nerdy crowd that their debut appealed to. That feeling of accepting sadness instead of risking the feeling of rejection is something that many of us nerds who love this band have felt. Rivers basically just sings about giving up on dating forever in fear of the pain that he's felt before. It perfectly displays that feeling of heartbreak and the anxiety of rejection in a very short time span. It's one of the faster and heavier tracks on the album, with its heavily distorted guitar power chords which give it an almost Ramones sort of era of punk sound. Track 5, Across the Sea, is one of the songs that saw the most controversy upon the album's release, because this is one of the songs on the album that I think humanizes Rivers more than any other. The song focuses on Rivers' attraction and love towards a girl who wrote him a fan letter. Many saw this as Rivers admitting how he's a disgusting man who is sex-craved and wants to sleep with all his fans, but the track really isn't like that at all. The track is about Rivers' complete isolation and loneliness, and how much the small amount of attention and interest given to him made him feel loved and wanted. There are definitely points where his more perverse thoughts are displayed in the song, but I feel like it's done in a much more self-deprecating way more than anything. The lyric about him imagining her touching herself definitely is one of the album's stranger lyrical choices, but I have never looked at it as something that's weird and creepy like a lot of people do. He imagines all of these different things about the girl, and the desperateness and loneliness he feels leads his head to imagine more perverted things like how she dresses and masturbates. It's a bit of a bad image to have, but that's kind of the point. I think Rivers displays that perfectly. He kind of questions himself for having these thoughts when he knows that they're wrong. And that's one of my favorite things about the song, the fact that Rivers has these feelings of love and attraction to this girl which he doesn't understand and that he knows he shouldn't have. It perfectly shows the state that his mind was in at the time, and I think lyrically it's pretty depressing because of this. It's an incredibly emotionally charged song with really great instrumentation and progression. The bridge is easily one of my favorite bridges the band have ever done. I love the chorus, I love the chord progression. This is just one of my favorite songs the band have ever done. The next song, The Good Life, was one of the few songs from the album that even when the band were pretending Pinkerton never happened, they would still play live. The track is Rivers singing about recovering from his operation and the isolation that was caused from him not being able to walk. But as well as this, Rivers sings about his longing for going back to the life of a normal man in his 20s, living without a care in the world, partying, sleeping around, and not having the pressures of fame and having to make an album. It's one of the most self-deprecating songs on the album and is one of the few where the constant self-doubt and jabbing at himself doesn't come off as really sad and depressing and is actually kind of funny. There are a lot of conflicting lyrics in the song as Rivers longs not just for the normal youthful life that he wishes he could have, but he also longs to go back to the rock star life that he wanted to step away from earlier on. It is a song that is contradictory in itself, but I think it perfectly describes how lonely and depressed Rivers was during this time. He essentially spends this song just longing for something other than not being able to move. It's definitely one of the darker songs on the album, but I think the bouncy tone and self-deprecating humor stop it from being straight up miserable. Instrumentally, it's one of the strongest on the album with a simple but memorable riff, fuzzy bass line which cuts through everything like a knife, and the guitar solo is fantastic and one of my favourite guitar solos on the album, even if it is incredibly simplistic. This is one of the catchiest songs on the album, there's no surprise why it became one of the lead singles. The first song the band released from the album was Scorcho, which was released a week before the album's released. Like the album did, it flopped. Radio stations refused to play it, it didn't play on MTV, and honestly, I can completely see why. Don't get me wrong, I really like this song, but it's not really a single-worthy song at all, especially the first single from the album. This was one of the most experimental and strange songs on the album. It's a song about essentially liking a girl and trying to find out if she likes you back, afraid that you'll get rejected. It's sung through some of the weirdest lyrics that the band have written at this point, with lyrical references to Public Enemy, lyrics about wrestling matches, as well as references to Madame Butterfly, the opera that heavily inspired Rivers while writing this record. It has these really weird, quirky backing vocals that sound like they were recorded while the band were messing around and then accidentally placed on the track. This song is basically two different songs, with the funky acoustic guitar section being the first song and then the fast hardcore punk bridge being the second song. Narratively, I think this is one of Rivers' stronger songs, putting out onto the table Rivers' feelings for the girl while being too awkward to express them properly. It's one of the most honest love songs he's ever written, and despite its really strange lyrics and instrumentation, I think it's one that works really well. The next song, Pink Triangle, is another one of my favorite Weezer songs. It has a fantastic main riff and great slide guitar lines which gives the song its own unique tone. The song is about falling for a girl who is unobtainable. Rivers sings about how he had an intense crush on a girl and thought she could be the one until he found out she was gay. It's a song that can definitely be seen as slightly homophobic, with the lyric "everyone's a little queer, why can't you be a little straight" being a lyric that is especially touchy, but I personally think it's a great song about the self-hatred of being betrayed by your own feelings for someone. The image of the pink triangle was a symbol used in the Holocaust to distinguish homosexual prisoners, but it's since been adopted as a symbol of gay pride. I think its reference in the song adds a power to the song's lyrics. The song is definitely a very honest song about the feeling of betrayal and trying to blame everyone but yourself. He wishes she was straight and hates her sexuality for keeping them apart, even though there would be a strong possibility that regardless that she still wouldn't like him. Its lyrics are very tongue-in-cheek and ridiculous, but at the same time pretty powerful. The incredibly fuzzy guitar lines are great as well, and the chorus is one of the most memorable on the album. Track 9, Falling For You, is another song about the girl Scorcho is based on. The girl starts to have feelings for Rivers, which leads him to feel incredibly confused and have to completely question his self-doubt and self-deprecation. It's a song that I think perfectly brings the themes of the album together. After spending 8 tracks thinking about how pathetic and depressed he is, he finally starts to find happiness and is forced to accept that maybe he isn't isn't quite as bad as he believes he is. But there is still a lot of self-doubt and fear displayed in the song, and Rivers starts to question his worthiness and starts to worry about the future. The song is filled with weird chord progressions and constant key changes, which definitely makes it one of the most unique and interesting songs on the album. But apart from that, I do think the song is mostly just a pretty straightforward Weezer song and one of the weaker on the album. But to be fair, calling this one of the weakest on the album is like saying cheese pizza is one of the weakest flavors of pizza. It's still a really great flavor. The album comes to a close with the final song, Butterfly, a somber, depressing acoustic track which is essentially based on the ending of Madame Butterfly. In the opera, the character of Pinkerton marries Chi-Chi-san but then leaves her alone, promising to return. When Chi-Chi-san realizes that he's not going to return, she decides to die in honor instead of shame and commit suicide. But just as she does it, Pinkerton returns. This song is essentially sung from the perspective of Pinkerton. Rivers sings about catching a butterfly in a jar and finding her withered away when he returns to her the next day. It's incredible how Rivers managed to tell this story while write an incredibly personal song which sounds like Rivers growing up and realizing that his actions have consequences, that the things he does to people may seem to have a very small impact on him but can have deep impact on other people. It's a beautiful, haunting and incredibly sad song, and honestly it's one of Rivers' best songs lyrically. It's just as simple as most of his songs, but it manages to say so much through its simplistic lyricism. The instrumentation is sparse, consisting of just Rivers' hushed and mellow vocals, the acoustic guitar and percussion which sounds very raw and slightly out of time. It's the perfect way to close the album in my opinion. Pinkerton is one of the weirdest albums of the 90s. It's deeply personal. Rivers puts all his self-doubts, worries and darkest feelings out into the world, and it's not hard to see why the album failed upon release. It's such a hard album to listen to because it's so desperate, genuine and open. But I think the lyrical honesty is one of the biggest draws on the album. The lyrics are the deepest that Rivers has ever written. It's an incredibly brave and authentic album. And although it was hated upon release, its influence was pretty much heard right away. There were hardcore fans of the album when it came out, and those voices seemed to get stronger and stronger by the year. During the band's 5-year hiatus following the record, emo was starting to break out into the rock mainstream, and many of the biggest emo bands of that time, such as Jimmy Eat World, Motion City Soundtrack and Dashboard Confessional, were citing it as a huge influence on them. Weezer would basically completely step away from everything that they did on this album and went back to the simpler, less personal songwriting of their first album, but I think that made a lot of people return to this album and retrospectively grow larger admiration for it. In 2002, Rolling Stone's readers voted it the 16th greatest album of all time. A year later, Pitchfork put it at number 53 on their best albums of the 90s. Rolling Stone re-reviewed the album, giving it a perfect score over its previous 6 out of 10. Although the band, especially Rivers, tried to pretend the album didn't exist and called it a complete misstep, in 2008, Rivers reconsidered it and called it a great album. In 2010, the band played the album in its entirety, something that they've basically done at least once a year ever since. It was certified platinum in 2016, it's been re-released and repressed to vinyl multiple times. It's fair to say that this album has had one of the best redemption stories in music history, and it deserves every bit of praise that it now gets. This is a masterpiece of an album. Weezer may have gone down the shitter, but this is one of the albums I still look at whenever I think of the band's greatest moments. Now time to go listen to some really terrible Fall Out Boy albums.